We have a quorum, so let's call on Dr. Severe to lead the way.
Thank you, Chair Pooper Walker. This is actually Ms. Masters'
Hey, that's correct.
policy,
Yes.
so she'll walk through those
Okay.
changes. Or
Thank you.
potential changes.
Potential, yeah. So as prescribed by our MOU with MNEA, the retention committee, which is comprised of some members of our HR team and MNEA, met to discuss teacher tenure policy adjustments as a retention strategy. And these are the resulting recommendations. And I am bringing them forward for consideration by this committee. Also, I did reach out to our chief of HR, seeing if there were any tweaks recommended, and did not receive any tweaks. So this is where we landed.
You want to walk through your amendments?
Sure.
Okay. Can somebody scroll? Anybody?
I can read, with these, I can read that better than I can read I would have to take these out, yeah, you know.
Highlighted.
It's the whole thing. The first one is,
It's on the second page, highlighted in yellow.
to, if you return and you have previously had tenure in Metro Nashville Public Schools, to have it reinstated within 90 instructional days. The second one is decreasing the this one referred back to the other, calling it a regular probationary period, which previously would be 2 years, but assuming that first change goes through, that needed to be changed as well to a probationary period of 1 year of service in the district to complete your 5 years for tenure. And then the last one refers to if you've had tenure in another district in the state. Oh, too far.
Line 20.
Or if you've been working towards tenure in another district, you need to complete at least a full year, your final year of service in MNPS to receive that tenure status. I think that's it.
So can we start with the first one of the three amendments here? Hello. And so currently, our policy says that they serve a 2-year probationary period upon reemployment unless the probationary period is waived by the board. Stop scrolling. Upon request of the director of schools. Upon completion of the 2-year period, the teacher shall either be recommended by the district for tenure or non-renewed. Okay. So that's the old, and so what does state statute say about teacher tenure? Case?
State statute is very similar to what we previously had, that it is discretion within a 2-year period.
What do most districts do? Do we know? Did you have a question, Ms.
But it is within state, it is allowable within state law for us to be more specific within that 2 years.
Elrod and then Mr. Little?
What benefits do we have to it being 2 years instead of 90 days?
Say that again?
What benefits do we have from it being 2 years instead of 90 days? 2 years to 90 days is a big cut. So what was the benefit to it being 2 years? And then if possible, what benefits do we have being at 90 days?
Ms. Dr. Battle?
Thank you. Ms. Roberge, I'll let you respond, and I'll add to if needed.
Thank you. So we had discussed this, some potential revisions in the MNEA, MNPS Retention Committee. We had not reached a final space with it. It was still up for discussion at our last retention meeting, and we had not finalized this. These were the initial set of drafts. The 90 days my understanding, the benefit there is that it could potentially be used as sort of a carrot. The downside from that operationally is that doesn't give a principal a full amount of time to really evaluate the teacher that they have in their building right now. So that principal we would be giving tenure to somebody who had not gone for an entire year with that principal. By using 2 years, that first year gives that principal the opportunity to evaluate that teacher and then make decisions based on their performance about non-renewal. Whereas if they have tenure, it could only be a termination for cause. So I think those are some of the operational challenges.
Ms. Masters?
Can I just say that I have a little bit of frustration that we're having this conversation now, since you knew about this and I asked you for your input on March 28th and let you know at that time that we were going to bring this forward as written on the 12th, and I didn't receive a response from you at that time. So I feel like communication, the fact that we're now having this communication here during the committee is a little frustrating.
I can respond to that, because part of this process with our collaborative conference and with MNEA is that if there are any policy changes, which we tend to stay out of the policy realm anyway, but any changes with regards to the MOU, the procedure here is for the administrative team or the representative to sit down with MNEA. They make a recommendation that should come actually to me, and then I will make that recommendation to the board. And so when I was apprised of where we were in communications, there was no recommendation that was going to come from me, given that we had not come to agreement on this particular policy. So I will take that responsibility, because there was not anything to recommend based upon where we were in those communications.
So it's just, I mean, it's board policy. So when the recommendation came my way, and then I reached out to HR about it and didn't receive a response, I moved forward with the recommendation. And I will say, I don't want it to sound like I'm a passive player in this, because I do believe strongly that tenure reinstatement can be a really great recruiting and retention tool for us. And I feel strongly that it should be less than 2 years. Although I am understanding of your concern about it being as short as 90 days. I think 2 years is longer than necessary, given that we're working with the retention committee to create strategies for retention, and I think this is a very valid recommendation.
Mr. Little?
Yeah. The question I would have, and it's driven by just messages that I may get from parents around teacher vacancies in the classroom and having kind of a substitute that is long-term. How many vacancies do we have in the district, and could this be beneficial to fill in some of those vacancies?
Dr. Battle?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you, Ms. Roberge. I'll let you do the initial response, and I'll add to if needed.
Sure. So currently, we have started posting and turned our attention towards next year.
Yep.
And so the vacancies would reflect numbers that we have for next year. I believe we do have about 200 posted, but the majority of those being for next school year, not current classroom teachers. That number would be significantly lower for that. In terms of this being a retention tool, there's also a piece to thinking long and hard before you leave the district about giving up your tenure as part of a retention tool. In our last retention meeting, we did come up with sort of several strategies that we thought would really be effective, and I don't have those offhand, but I'd be happy to pull them, and that the MNEA leadership, the teacher representatives, the administration representatives all really thought could be effective, and we had not returned to this conversation. And what we also discovered as we were talking about different retention strategies, like high quality access to materials, the district is already taking steps to do that. As we were talking about our leadership framework, that was a big piece, that having strong leadership in schools, and we're already taking steps to do that. So that was where our conversation really centered on.
So how many vacancies would you say we have this year, though, before you guys started to transition into last year? I mean, to the upcoming year?
We were averaging in a classroom about 70.
Okay.
For the entire district, which is
Yes.
pretty low, it's over a school year's time. Every vacancy matters, though, and so that's critically important. But I can speak to this from several lands, one of them being a principal. As a principal, a shift in this policy really does take away their ability to coach and to evaluate for quality leaders in all of their classrooms. So while we think of it potentially as a recruiting strategy, it might actually do the opposite, because they might have a little more hesitation because they then don't have the authority to make sure that they have the quality in every classroom, given their annual process as we do the student-based budgeting process, where they can talk through and share their coaching opportunities and what shifts they need to make from year to year. So that is just a concern that I have just from a principal's lens, and it being used not just as a retention strategy, but as we think through what the recruiting strategy could look like as well.
Ms. Elrod?
Considering the want to have a recruitment strategy of giving pause to not move around between districts, and the want, which I am probably the most interested in, of making sure that we evaluate teachers, and that 90 days doesn't provide that evaluation period for principals. Instead of it being 90 days, could we amend it and still allow, would it still provide time if we amended it to a year instead of 2 years, so that we are still lessening the amount, but we are also providing that evaluation time and structured time? Is that a possibility?
So we've had some of these conversations even before this particular policy conversation today. There are many challenges with that. One of them being the timing of which we do the budgeting process and the hiring from year to year, coinciding with a decision around tenure. Essentially, at a year's time, that's not good timing for a principal to be making those decisions and evaluating against what they have as far as the teacher's observation scores and performance scores. So that's one thing. A second concern here is that we do need to provide our principals and our administrative team time to review all of the information we have. And I will tell you, there have been several situations where down the line, as things come up and have happened, that we found information and been able to review information around why someone would not be recommended for tenure. And so we just need all of those various data points and timing, so that our principals who ultimately make these decisions are equipped with what they need to make sure that in granting tenure, they're doing so in good faith of the quality instructor that they will be putting in front of our students.
So I assume my blunt follow-up is what is your minimum amount that you would request us?
The state policy is there. I wouldn't recommend above or beyond what's there right now. Requires the 2-year probationary period with acceptable, if that's the right word, evaluation scores and other data points, so that our principals and our leaders are making informed decisions. There is a clause in there for some discretion at the director's level, and what we've been trying to figure out is how we can make, if there are any discretionary decisions, how we can do so in a very objective manner, so that it's solely based on the quality of instruction that is provided and not the individual teacher.
It's my understanding, and I don't know because John is not here, from a legal perspective. I thought that the legal answer that we received originally was that it was up to 2 years, not that it has to be 2 years.
That's right.
So that there is some flexibility that it could be less than 2 years. If that's the case, which I thought was the original conversation we had on the board floor, if that was the case, I would like for us to be able to see what other surrounding districts have. If our conversation as a board is that we want to be using this as a retention or recruitment value,
Quality.
I would not want us to choose something based upon our own assumptions of what surrounding districts are doing. If there's a lot of flexibility, where 2 years is not the minimum, but the maximum. 90 days, frankly, seems like too little. So I thought the 1 year was a good middle ground. but it's sounding like that's still not enough somehow for our district. So I'd be interested in what other districts are doing, if that's possible information to get.
Is it okay if and I think if we turn our attention back to this policy, which is pulled from that law, it says that they shall serve a two-year probationary period upon reemployment unless the probationary period is waived by the board upon request of the director of schools. So that is the language. And secondarily to your question and having conversations with other directors across the district, this is a retention strategy. And so most districts approach it as a retention strategy and not both the recruitment and retention aspect.
Ms. Gentry, Dr. Gentry?
Yeah, so that was going to be my original question, was what was the purpose of the policy? Because I would hate for us to have, be reading about a hammer and trying to use it as a screwdriver. So so you believe, or your understanding is that this original policy was a retention strategy.
Correct.
So say more about that. Are you suggesting that if, as a tenured teacher, I would think twice about leaving and giving up my tenure? Because the tenure is, so the tenure is associated with the district. It's not the person. So it's not a tenured person, it's a person with tenure in a district.
Correct.
Okay. That helps. That helps a lot. And so when you leave, you give up that status in the district. And so upon return, what is happening in the 2 years? So the suggestion here is that, would I recommend this person now for tenure again? That's the question that we're trying to ask.
That's correct, or as opposed to waiting the two-year probationary period as stated currently in the policy.
But even after that 2 years, that person would have to be recommended, or is after 2 years, is it automatically reinstated?
No, there are certain criteria by which each teacher must meet and then be recommended for tenure.
So I just want to make sure we understand that it's not that I don't believe that the tenure is associated with a person. That person is not coming back as a tenured person. It's a status within the district, which for me makes a difference. It's a subtle, but it makes a difference. And then the question that has to be answered by the district is, so let me ask a different question. How long can this person be gone? Does that say that?
No.
Oh, well, hell, we got a bigger problem. Sorry.
Yeah, and TCA doesn't specify either.
Are you sure?
I want you to use your microphone.
Thank you, I have permission. But this also doesn't say, so I can be gone 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, and this same process applies.
Correct.
Okay, so my suggestion would be that we're playing with the wrong part of the policy. Because if somebody's gone 5 years, I need to know what's been happening, and I would want time, right, to see if this person qualifies for tenure. I don't know what they've been doing since they've been gone, right? So I think the part of the policy that really matters is how long they've been gone, because then reinstating them in a shorter period of time makes sense to me, versus not caring how long you've been gone and then reducing the amount of time to reinstate you. Does that make sense?
Like the way you think.
John?
And I think we're having it around retention, but I also want to think about quality, and I want to bring some color to just emails that I get. And one parent who has been devastated that her child is sitting in a classroom with a long-term substitute says that, why couldn't they just turn it into a study hall? Why are we playing school? Why didn't parents know? And so when I look at this policy and I'm listening to the debate, I also say, in the times that we have right now, we have to make different decisions. When people got their stimulus checks, it was a different time, and the stimulus checks started and they stopped. And so when I think about where we are, and when I asked how many vacancies, we said 70. And if that averaged 25 people per classroom, that's 1,750 students who don't have a teacher for a certain subject. And just for me, the last point that I'll point out, when I toured a couple of schools, I sit in the classroom and it was, I want to say it was calculus. I didn't know what I was doing, and the substitute didn't know what they were doing, and we were kind of just hanging out and kind of talking about strategies where we can support the students as a study hall. But although that substitute meant well and she ran a really good classroom, those students were missing the time. And so when I think about a policy like this, I'm not talking about retention. I'm really looking at quality, because as those students leave that classroom, although well-mannered, they won't have the details to take them, because math is very foundational. And then I'm going to pass it back to Ms. Gentry. Okay.
Did you want to respond to him?
No, just one thing I wanted to clarify. If we have a long-term sub in a classroom, they have to be certified. So they would have to be a certified teacher if they're a long-term sub.
And what dictates long-term?
More than 20 days.
Dr. Gentry?
So that was the first thing I was going to clarify, is that there is a period, but I think we're saying the same thing, Mr. Little, about quality, right? And so again, a teacher who received a status of tenure in this district and has gone for some extended amount of time, I think I owe it to my students to ensure that I'm returning a quality teacher to that classroom. So I don't think we're talking about different things. I don't think just willy-nilly taking a person back and putting them in a classroom is ensuring quality. So I think that there is a middle ground here that, again, back to what I said, that let's look at the amount of time they're gone to determine what that probationary period needs to be, versus somebody's gone 3, 4, 5, 7 years and just giving them 90 days to go back into the classroom.
Ms. Blair?
I guess this is my confusion. How is this a recruitment or retention solution? You don't want the teacher to leave in the first place, because we're putting time and effort and investment into training them to teach our students the way our students need to be taught. You're trying to avoid them leaving. So I guess I don't understand how that helps with recruiting, because you're going to say, oh, hey, come work for us. You can leave and come back, and then you'll still keep your tenure, when we don't want them to leave in the first place. So I guess that's my first, and how does this answer that question of retention and also, of recruitment? And then also, how does it answer the question of even retention? Because you want to retain the teacher in the same district or environment and keep the institutional knowledge within the environment. Because my assumption is, if you're doing it for educational reasons, you can take a sabbatical or a leave of absence and still retain your tenure.
For up to a year, I think.
So I guess that's kind of my question of kind of the premise of the argument of doing it. I kind of agree with Dr. Gentry of the kind of a sliding scale, for lack of a better word. If you're doing something like that for whatever reason, medical, life event happens. But I guess that's my part of tenure. This amendment does not, I don't see how it addresses tenure or recruitment. Because if you're going in, I don't know how this will be a deciding factor of recruiting or retaining. I mean, you want someone to stay and to grow within our system. So I guess that's the question I have for the table.
Ms. Masters?
So first thing, appreciate most of what you just said. I think the one about it somehow being a retention that people know they're going to have to then wait 2 years to get it reinstated when they come back, that doesn't hold a whole lot of water with me. It feels sort of like we're going to hold you hostage with your tenure status, and I don't think that's the type of retention strategy that we're looking for. But aside from that, this is the result of the function of the retention committee and their recommendations. And in order for that process, which is MOU prescribed, to work, there has to be participation by all parties. And then that has to be clearly communicated to the board if it then involves policy adjustments. So assuming that we are going back to working within the 2-year strategy, I think it would be helpful to know what exactly in MNPS would qualify for that recommendation to have the status reinstated sooner. And then we might even make a case that we need to hold off on this until we have more clarity from the retention committee, from all sides. Because, right now, we're only hearing from Dr. Battle and HR, which is very helpful, and then we're sort of like postulating on what we think. But I think it would need to, I mean, the function of the committee is that it's a collaborative process. So I certainly wouldn't want to say, well, never mind, taking it off the table, let's just leave it as it is, knowing that this was a subject of concern for the members of that committee. I would want them to have the opportunity to weigh in. Because that was my intention with the policy, and being the board member who recommended it, was my attempt to honor that process of the committee's function.
So I'm confused because I thought the process was that they worked with MNPS, came to a set of understandings, recommendations, came to Dr. Battle, she presents them to the board. So are we getting cart ahead of the horse here if we haven't gotten the recommendations yet solidified? Am I misunderstanding the process?
I mean, I received the recommendation and brought it forward. So, and I had no understanding or assumption of the process needing to work differently within that.
So I would just suggest that in revisiting, that it's a three-pronged deal. So if we're trying to use this as a retention, a recruitment, and when I would say recruitment, Ms. Player Peters, I would think from the perspective of recruiting former teachers back into the district, not new teachers.
I missed, okay.
Yeah, so it would be a recruitment strategy for former teachers, a retention strategy for the teachers we have, and then the third piece, which Mr. Little brought up, but I think I'm taking just a different take on it, is the quality piece. How do we ensure that however this process fleshes out, that the student that's coming back into the district, the teacher that's coming back into the district is the teacher we want to put in front of our students, and we want to reinstate tenure for. So I think that's the piece that's missing for me, is that quality, that ensuring that it's the right teacher that we're putting back and reinstating tenure for.
And then I would like to add to that, in this review of how did we get to the 90 days, whether that's through Dr. Battle and coming back to, it feels like the appropriate line of what we were supposed to have done without knowledge was to get this recommendation from an entire review of it internally. But I hear that we were unaware of that expectation. Within that review, I would like us, if we're going to discuss less than 2 years, but the feeling from HR and leadership is that 2 years needs to be required for this retainment piece of it. If we were to remove some of that 2 years based upon their qualifications or how long they've been gone, or the sliding scale as suggested by my colleague, Dr. Gentry, we still, as a responsibility of the board, have a responsibility to support you within that recruitment and retainment piece of it. So if we're removing a tool and you believe this 2 years to be a tool, what is the other thing that you need from us? And that should be provided to us as well in the suggestions. I agree that the 90 days seems very short because of the evaluations. But I do think that we need a bigger discussion on what is it, because to my colleague, Ms. Messer's point, the 1 year I just pulled out of a hat. Not a literal hat, but you know what I'm saying. So I would like for us to have a more educated response to that based upon Dr. Gentry's comments, what surrounding counties are doing, what they consider that best practice to be, of course, what's legally required, and then if we are going to lessen it from that 2 years, which we are believing to be the right recruitment or retainment strategy, what are we replacing some of that with? So that's what I would like in those recommendations that we receive back when we review it.
So am I missing something here? So you're saying we got recommendations?
I
didn't
received
get recommendations.
this from members of the committee.
But I thought the process was that the committee comes to an understanding, presents those to the director presents the recommendations of the committee to the board.
But I would have had no knowledge of that step of the process at that point. And of course, board sets policy, so.
I understand that, but what I'm saying is the process that we have agreed to with MNEA is this collective coming to a set of recommendations that are presented to the director of schools, who brings them before the board.
Hey.
Is that your understanding of how this works? Okay.
I'm not sure that that's explicit, though, within the structure of the committees as prescribed by the MOU.
It's in the MOU.
It should be in the MOU.
I say, it should be in the MOU. My addition, real quick, I'm so sorry, John, and I promise I'm getting back to you. My addition is going to be that if we have the situation again, because this is not the first time where we feel like there's a miscommunication of who should have really come first, is that if we see that on the agenda, whether that's from the administration, feels like we're getting the cart before the horse, or we feel like we should have known something, is that is communicated internally. Whether that communication should have happened from Dr. Battle or support staff or whomever, but if there's a communication of like, hey, I think we're getting the cart before the horse, before we get here, I think that conversation probably would have been helpful, because it is maybe not clear, particularly to newer board members, and it would not be clear for particularly me. I'm not involved in the MOU. Review committee, I wouldn't have been involved in that conversation, so I may not would have known that either. So I wish that conversation would have taken place, and I'm sorry, John, I jumped over you, but I just wanted to add that.
Sorry, John, just real quick, I just want to say,
John!
just because I'll forget what I was saying, I attempted to engage in that process by reaching out to get response. I did take no response as, no, we don't have tweaks, because I did share this version exactly.
And can I ask a clarifying question?
Let me just clarify one thing, because
Sorry,
I don't,
It is okay.
they're gonna say
it was communicated that the process had not been completed. And so there's a process to this, and I think there's ongoing meetings. I think there have been one that's come up where there's been brief conversations about it, but it takes time when you're talking about the collaborative conferencing process to share the data, share the information, to come to agreement. It's the same process we go through with our MOU. There are things that, administration, union representatives bring to the table. We work and talk through those, and as we all know, it takes quite a bit of time to work through everything to come to agreement before presenting.
Mr. Little?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. So just a clarifying question. So when the recommendations from the ad hoc committee are presented to the support hub, what's the timeline or timetable for it to finally come to the board? So let's say it was presented in February. Is it like a 30, 60, or 90-day before we can actually discuss it? And I think if somebody has it, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Ms. Roberts.
There isn't a timeline set out in the MOU, and it depends on what we're discussing, but the MOU does lay out that this committee that has MNEA members, both their leadership members, myself, Dr. Bellamy, will have discussions and then work with the director of schools, and then from there, certain strategies go to the board, some strategies are just operational and wouldn't go to the board. So there's a mix in there.
So respectfully with that, it could come in 30 days or it can come in 180 days. And I think the clarity that we need is when a committee works on something that we agree upon and it's presented. I think there needs to be a timetable, whether it's 180 or 30, that we can work together and actually hear it. And I'll see.
Okay. Ms. Tyler?
And where do our annual review monitoring come into that as well? Because this was supposed to be reviewed in January, and I just went and double-checked, and we definitely did not.
What was supposed to be reviewed in January?
The teacher tenure policy. And so I just wanted to make sure that, if we're going to follow the things that were, because I went back, we did review policies in January, and we did make our recommendations and vote on them in January, but this was not one that was included. So I don't know if that's because it was pushed off because something happened and the meeting hadn't been able to happen yet. I'm not sure why, but if we're setting timelines and we're talking timelines, we have a timeline as well for this. So there's more than one timeline we need to keep in mind.
So, and I'm going to kick it to David Sevier in just a moment. These are two totally separate. We typically don't take up policy and the recommendation in these committees that you're talking about. This is just kind of an outlier situation, but David Sevier owns the policy review process on behalf of the district.
So, Ms. Tyler, so that's my role. So when it says reviewed, usually in January, usually it is in January, and since it is still legal, there was nothing that changed in statute that would necessitate a change to this policy. The review didn't yield anything that needed to come before the board to keep you compliant.
Okay, so it's, you review it
Yes, ma'am.
annually, and we only review it if you think there needs to be a change? Or if there's a legal change that must be made?
That's correct. Or if the board feels like that policy is not meeting the needs of the district.
Okay.
Okay, Ms. Masters?
I just want to clarify, having received this information from retention committee members and wanting to be diligent in bringing it forward, I did reach out on March 28th and was told that Ms. Roberge had met with Dr. Battle and discussed this. And what I sent was referred to as a draft. And I requested any changes be sent my way. So this was my attempt to work within the prescribed process as I understood it at that time, not to usurp anyone's authority or to even overstep and bring forth a policy recommendation that didn't genuinely come from the entire committee. So I just want to clarify that and say that, for the fact that the committee met on February 22nd, I think it's reasonable to believe that we should have some actionable items by April 12th.
Claire?
So I have some technical clarification. So this retention committee is a committee housed under the MOU collaborative process structure. Is that correct?
Correct.
So this is not a committee of the board.
No.
So that's a different, for me, that's a different processing issue and a different governance issue, because it's not a committee of the board, it's a committee of the MOU collaborative process that comes out of the collective, lack of a better term, we don't have collective bargaining, but collective conferencing. Yeah, the union part of me doesn't like that. Part of that. So I guess there's a part of me that's concerned about that process from a worker's perspective, just given my history of, I feel like sometimes the devil's in the details. And so I'm trying to think of a process where a committee comes up with something, is decided, but then implementation of it, because the intent of something could be different than implementation of something. And then how does our one employee implement it? That, I'm going to stop there because I'm stuck in my car. Okay.
Right. So, yes.
I'd like to call a point of order. It's almost 3:45. And so I'd just like to get clarity on what are the next steps about this policy, and that we separate revisiting the process of how this should happen going forward and what we're going to do about this policy that's on the screen now.
So we don't have a motion, right?
I'll make a motion that we request this be reviewed by the retention committee, and then through discussion with Dr. Battle, that we at a future date bring forth something that is adjusted to fulfill the desires of everyone on that, sorry, that's the best word I could come up with, on that committee. With the understanding that this is board policy and it is our position to set policy, also with the understanding that it is supposed to be a collaborative process. And that I think I'm sorry, this is a really long motion. I'm okay with tabling it, I guess, knowing that there's going to actually be swift action for us to move to do something with
So the
this
motion is to
policy
table.
in the near future. Yeah.
Okay.
Second, if the motion's to table, second.
Okay. Discussion.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I would say if we put a timeline on it, I think to table it and not put a specific timeline on it, we can move forward, but we got to say, well, and it's based on recommendations, when do we want to discuss it? Is this by the end of the year or by the beginning of the new school year? But if without a timetable, we'll keep punting back and forth.
I'll amend the motion. I would like to make a motion that we table this until our second May meeting, if that feels
I second that.
Okay. Do we know that the final recommendations have come out of the committee yet? Do we know what the timeline of that will be?
No, because part of the collaborative conferencing process is that we continue to discuss until there's either agreement or a determination that we move on from that topic or agenda item. So to me, it's very difficult to put a time frame on it unless we have an understanding that we'll come back potentially and say, we've not come to agreement on any recommendations here. That is a possibility. We try to come to.
So in particular, the retention committee, there have not been a final set of recommendations
That's correct.
from that retention
There's
committee.
not been a final recommendation from the committee.
So we would potentially be revisiting this policy prior to
Correct.
a set of recommendations from the committee.
That's correct.
I mean, I would say as the board member that brought the policy forward, I will be comfortable with us making a decision on it by the end of May. I will come fully equipped to put forth an amended recommendation with or without that recommendation from the retention committee.
Any other comments? So do you want to repeat your motion?
I make a motion that we table this policy amendment consideration until our second May meeting.
A second.
Okay. All those in favor? Okay. All those opposed? All right. Motion passes. All righty. We have one more. We're going to squeeze in here, Title IX and sexual harassment. And we have, hi there.
I'm Carly Elliott, Executive Director, Civil Rights and Title IX Coordinator. I am cautiously optimistic that this will be quick. I did not do a good job of prettily highlighting, wish that I had, but I will point out that we are not making any large substantive changes. We received new Title IX federal regulations about almost 2 years ago now, and we drafted a whole new Title IX policy. Now that we've gotten into the weeds of carrying out that policy for 2 years, one thing that I noted is that we don't need to specify exactly who's carrying out the investigator, decision maker, and appeals officer roles. So when we initially created this policy, we said specifically investigators will be EDs of schools. We now know that legally, anyone who's trained on Title IX specifically can carry out that role. So all I've really done in this policy is removed the specific titles and specified that those who are trained on Title IX may be assigned by the Title IX coordinator to investigate, make decisions, or handle appeals. And I can direct you to those exact lines if you want me to. That would be page 1, line 14. Gives myself permission to deputize someone else as Title IX coordinator if I'm out, say on medical leave. Page 4, line 3, gives myself the ability to assign anyone who's specifically trained to act as investigator. Page 5, line 9, gives myself the ability to assign anyone as decision maker who's specifically assigned or has been specifically trained. Those are my changes. In practice, they shouldn't impact anything that we're doing currently. Any questions? Yes.
Claire?
So, in other words, we're giving you the power to deputize someone who's trained in Title IX sexual harassment claims.
And there's some specifics around those trainings. And it's part of my role to ensure that anyone who would be deputized as Title IX coordinator or assigned as an investigator, or decision maker, or appeals officer has had the appropriate training around Title IX.
And does this include someone outside? So if they're an outside investigation requested, does that give you the power to deputize someone who's outside the school system that we hire as a consultant to investigate?
In theory, yes. Yeah, so let's say I were out on maternity leave and we needed someone to fill that role for long-term, I could deputize them as an interim Title IX coordinator.
Other questions? Can I get a motion?
To approve changes to Title IX policy. I don't.
Second.
Discussion? Okay, all those in favor? Much, passes unanimously. Thank you. I believe we are finished with the governance committee, so we will adjourn at this point, and I will pass the baton to my friend